Lorne Mackay posted his ad on a Tuesday the same way he would have posted a notice about a missing fence post, direct, factual and without apology. Seeking a capable woman 30 to 45 to manage household on working cattle ranch near Pincher Creek, Alberta. Must be practical, must be willing to live remote, must not require conversation to feel comfortable. Widower with no children. Respond in writing to Box 14, Pincher Creek Post Office. He did not mention that the house had not been properly cleaned in 2 years. He did not mention that the last woman who had tried to cook in that kitchen had lasted 11 days before driving herself back to Lethbridge, without saying goodbye. He did not mention that the winters near the Rockies had a way of pressing down on a person that was not exactly loneliness and not exactly cold, but something that lived between the two and had no word for it in English. What he got back 6 weeks later was a letter from a woman in Edmonton named June Alderton. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further. I have told this story a few times over the years. To a cousin at a dinner table, to a neighbor once while fixing a section of fence, and every time I get to June Alderton, people assume she was the kind of woman who needed saving. The kind who answered an ad like Lorne's because she had run out of other options. I want you to understand before anything else that June Alderton had plenty of options. She chose this one on purpose. And that is what made everything that followed both harder and more interesting than Lorne Mackay had planned for. Lorne Mackay had come to the Pincher Creek area in 1987, the year he turned 31, with a used truck, a cattle trailer, 40 head of Black Angus and the kind of silence that follows a person after a marriage ends badly and a farm gets sold to pay the lawyers. He was not originally from Alberta. He was from a small place outside of Kenora, Ontario, which he never talked about and which I will not describe in detail, because the story is not about where Lorne came from. It is about what he became in the foothills, in the space between the mountains and the prairie, where the wind comes over the pass and flattens everything that isn't rooted deep enough. By the time he posted the ad, he was 43. He had grown the herd to 220 head. He had replaced the original farmhouse roof twice, rebuilt the barn once, and installed a water system that finally stopped freezing in January. He was, by any reasonable measure, a capable man who had built something real with his own hands. He was also the kind of man who had eaten supper alone for 7 years and had stopped noticing. The woman shortage in that part of Alberta was not as severe as it had been in the 1880s, but the math still had a kind of honest brutality to it. There were not many single women within an hour's drive of Pincher Creek who wanted to live 20 minutes down a gravel road with no cell service, and a man who communicated primarily through the timing of coffee. Lorne had tried. He had gone to a church function in Cowley that a neighbor's wife had organized with transparent intent. He had once been persuaded to drive to Calgary for what was described to him as a casual dinner, and turned out to be a kind of structured evaluation involving a woman named Denise who worked in financial planning, and who said halfway through the entree, "So you don't own a smartphone at all?" in a tone that answered its own question. So he wrote the ad. He wrote it the way he approached most problems, by stating exactly what was needed and leaving out everything else. June Alderton's letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in March. Lorne had not been checking the post office box with any urgency. He had sent the ad to 2 publications, a regional farming paper and a community newsletter out of Calgary that a friend had suggested, and he had not exactly expected a response. He had thought, if he was being honest with himself, that posting the ad was more of an action than a plan. A way of doing something instead of nothing. He read the letter standing in the post office parking lot with the truck running. "Mr. Mackay, I am 38 years old. I was a nurse for 11 years and then I managed the logistics for a mid-sized agricultural supply company out of Edmonton for 4 years after that. Which means I can start an IV line and I can read a balance sheet. And I am not afraid of inventory. I have been told I am direct to the point of being uncomfortable and I consider this a reasonable description. I grew up on a mixed grain farm outside of Lacombe. I know what a foothills winter is. I know what remote means. I have a few questions before I would consider coming to see the property. First, is the kitchen functional or has it been used primarily as a storage room? Second, is there a reason the previous arrangement did not work out? And if so, are you willing to say what it was? Third, what do you mean by does not require conversation? Because there is a difference between someone who does not need small talk and someone who has simply stopped trying. I am not interested in the first kind of arrangement. If you would like to call, my number is below. I am available after 6 on weekdays. June Alderton. Lorne sat in the truck for a while. The engine was still running. He turned it off, read the letter again, then started the truck and drove home. He called her that evening at 7 minutes after 6. She arrived on a Saturday in late April, which is not spring in the foothills so much as it is the threat of spring. Snow still possible, mud certain, the air carrying the smell of something coming without committing to what it was. She drove herself in a 5-year-old Subaru that was cleaner than Lorne had expected and older than he had assumed. She was tall, which he had not known from the letter, and she wore the kind of clothes that are practical without being careless. Work pants, A good jacket, boots that had seen real use. She had dark hair that was going silver at the temples and she wore it back without fuss. Her first words to Lorne Mackay, standing in his driveway with gravel under her boots, and the mountains behind her in a sky that was doing three things at once were, "Your fence line along the road needs attention before June. You've got at least 4 posts heaving from the frost." Lorne said, "I know." June said, "I'm just telling you I noticed." He showed her the house. She walked through it the way a person walks through something they are assessing and not yet judging. Quietly, with her hands in her jacket pockets touching nothing. She looked at the kitchen for a long time. She looked at the stove, which was a good stove and perfectly functional. She looked at the window above the sink, which faced west toward the mountains. And she stood there for a moment longer than the kitchen strictly required. She said, "The light is good in here." He hadn't thought about the light. He said, "I suppose it is." She turned around and looked at him. She had gray eyes and the kind of directness in them that made Lorne feel briefly that he had been read more thoroughly than he had intended. She said, "I want to be clear about something before we talk further. I'm not interested in a situation where I do the domestic labor and accept whatever terms come with it by default. If I come here I want to know what we're both agreeing to." Lorne said, "What are you asking for?" June said, "A room that's mine and stays mine until we decide otherwise. A role in decisions about the property, not just the house. And I want Sundays off before 2 in the afternoon. No exceptions unless it's an actual emergency, and by emergency I mean livestock in danger, not a fence post." Lorne had negotiated with cattle buyers and equipment dealers and a bank that had told him no twice before it told him yes. He had not been negotiated with by a woman in a kitchen he had not cleaned properly since January. He said, "The Sundays are fine, you can have the back bedroom. It's bigger than mine and has a better view. The property decisions are fair." June looked at him. She had expected friction. She had arrived prepared to hold her ground on every point. And she had a very clear picture in her mind of what holding her ground would look like. She had not prepared for a man who simply agreed because the terms were reasonable. She said, "Most people push back on at least one." Lorne said, "They were reasonable terms." He put the kettle on. It was the most domestically deliberate thing he had done in 8 months. She did not simply settle in. Within the first week, June Alderton had reorganized the pantry by a system that made more sense than Lorne's system, which had been primarily chronological by purchase and therefore chaotic. She had found a slow leak under the bathroom sink and fixed it herself before mentioning it to Lorne. At which point she mentioned it as information rather than complaint. She had also quietly refolded every blanket in the linen closet into a size that actually fit the shelves. Lorne came home one evening from checking the south pasture to find a cast iron pan he had forgotten he owned sitting on the stove, seasoned and ready. He stood and looked at it for a while. He said, "Where did you find that?" June said, "Top shelf of the mudroom, behind the spare harness parts. It's a good pan. Someone put a lot of work into that seasoning." He said, "That was my wife's." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable but was not quite comfortable either. June said, "Do you want me to put it back?" Lorne said, "No," and then, after a moment, she would have thought it was a waste to leave it up there. He did not say anything more, but the next morning without being asked he fixed the 4 fence posts along the road that June had mentioned the day she arrived. She had not told him about the fiddle before she came. He had not asked about hobbies because it had not occurred to him that the question was relevant. So when he came in from the barn on her 3rd Sunday, the first Sunday she had actually taken before 2 in the afternoon, and heard music coming from the back of the house, he stopped in the mudroom with one boot off. It was not violin music exactly. It was a fiddle, which is the same instrument played in a completely different way. Faster, in some places more inhabited. Like the music was not being performed so much as it was being inhabited from the inside. He did not know the tune. Later he would find out it was an old Métis reel that June had learned as a girl from a neighbor outside Lacombe, and that she had played it every Sunday afternoon since she was 11 years old. He sat down on the mudroom bench with one boot in his hand and listened for 12 minutes. He did not tell her. He simply came in quietly when it was done and started supper. By July, June was riding with Lorne to check the north pasture most mornings. She had ridden as a girl but not for years, and the first week she was stiff in a way she did not complain about and Lorne did not mention. She fell behind once on a narrow trail section, and when she caught up he said nothing, and neither did she. By the 3rd week, she was comfortable enough to ride in silence for an hour, without the silence feeling like a test. It was on one of those mornings, riding east along the ridge with the mountains behind them and the light coming long across the grass, that June said without preamble, "You don't talk much about what happened before." Lorne said, "No." She waited. He said nothing more for a while and then he said, "I don't find it useful." June said, "That's not the same as it not being there." He looked at her. She was watching the horizon in the way that people watch something they are not actually looking at. She said, "I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm just noting that I can tell the difference between a person who is quiet by nature and a person who has gone quiet on purpose." Lorne said, "Is that a problem?" June said, "Not for me. I just thought you should know that I noticed." It was, Lorne thought later, a strange kind of kindness. To say I see you without asking anything in return. The thing that broke something open happened in late September, which is fall in the foothills in a way that means business. The aspens turned fast. The frost came at night, and the light had a particular quality in the evenings that made the mountains look closer than they were, blue-gray and absolute against the sky. June got a call on the landline on a Thursday evening. Lorne was doing the books at the kitchen table, and he heard her voice from the back hallway change. Not dramatically, but in a way that a person notices when they have lived in a house with someone long enough to know the difference between their ordinary voice and their careful voice. When she came back to the kitchen, she stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Lorne looked up from the books. She said, "My dad had a fall. He's in Lacombe General. They think he'll be all right, but it's his hip, and he's 74, and I need to go." Lorne said, "Of course," she said. "The cattle," he said. "I managed before go." She looked at him. She said, "I might be gone a week, maybe more." He said, "June, go." She left the next morning before it was light. She did not ask him to water her herb pots, or check the seeds she had started in the south window of the spare room. She did not ask because it was not the moment for it. He watered the pots and checked the seeds every morning for 11 days. When she came back, she walked in on a gray afternoon in early October, set her bag down in the mudroom, and came into the kitchen and stopped. The herb pots were on the windowsill, green and not dead. She stood there looking at them for a moment longer than she needed to. She said, "You didn't have to do that." Lorne said, "They would have died." She did not say anything else. But that evening she made a meal that was more than the practical kind of cooking she did on weekdays. She made her mother's borscht, the real kind that takes most of the afternoon, with beets from the garden she had put in back in May, and sourdough that she had started from a culture she brought from Edmonton in a small jar she kept in the back of the fridge. He ate 3 bowls. He said nothing until the end, and then he said, "This is the best thing I've eaten in this house since I built it." June said, "Don't tell your mother." Lorne said, "My mother's been gone 12 years. June looked at him. It was the most personal information he had ever given her in one sentence, and she received it carefully. The way you receive something fragile that someone is not quite sure they meant to hand you. She said quietly, "Then I'm glad you enjoyed it." The winter was a serious one. January came in with 3 weeks of cold that had a sound to it at night. The house settling, the trees cracking, the particular silence of deep frost that is not peaceful but is something else, something older and more demanding. Lorne checked cattle in temperatures that were not safe for extended time outdoors. June took over the bookkeeping because she was faster at it than Lorne, and because it needed to be done, and she was there. There was an evening in late January when a heifer went into a difficult labor, and Lorne came in for extra rope, and found June already pulling her boots on. He said, "You don't need to come," she said. "I was a nurse for 11 years. I have strong hands and I'm not afraid of what this looks like." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Grab the small lamp from the shelf." They worked together in the barn for 2 hours. The calf came out wrong and then right, and the heifer was exhausted and confused, and the calf was alive and wet and working hard at the problem of existence, and afterward they stood in the barn with their breath, making clouds, and the smell of everything around them that a barn smells like on a hard night. June said, "Does she have a name?" Lorne said, "The heifer? I just call her 41. She's tag 41. June said, "Not her, the calf." Lorne said, "I don't name the calves." June looked at the calf for a moment. She said, "Then I won't either." But she smiled when she said it, and Lorne saw it, and it was the kind of smile that arrives without permission and cannot be recalled. They walked back to the house in the dark. The snow had a crust on it that held, mostly. Their boots made a particular sound on it that was not unpleasant. They did not talk, they did not need to. In February, during a stretch of days when the temperature lifted enough to be almost bearable, June spent a week doing something in the small room off the back hallway, that she had asked to use for storage, and that Lorne had said yes to without asking what she needed it for. He heard occasional sounds. The movement of things, a measuring tape, the particular concentration of a person working without hurry. When she was done she said, "I want to show you something," which was not the kind of sentence Lorne Mackay had heard in this house, and he followed her down the hallway not knowing what to expect. She had built a record shelf. Not from new lumber. She had used the good planks from a broken pallet that had been sitting in the equipment shed for a year, and she had sanded them and fitted them to the wall, with brackets she had found in the workshop and adapted. And the result was 3 shelves in the corner of the small room, built level and solid, and on the shelves were already her fiddle case, her small collection of books, and a framed photograph of her father, standing in front of a grain elevator that Lorne recognized as somewhere near Lacombe. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. He said, "You built that yourself." June said there were good tools in the shop. He said, "You can use the tools anytime." She said, "I know I did." He almost smiled. He said, The brackets are from the old chicken tractor I dismantled in 2019. June said they were the right size. He looked at the shelves for a while. They were not fancy. They were clean and straight, and made from materials that had been sitting waiting to be used, and there was a carved groove along the front edge of each one. Not deep, just a line, a small deliberate mark that served no functional purpose. He said, "You put a detail on the edge." June said, "It looked unfinished without something." Lorne said nothing. He went to the workshop and found a good piece of pine he had been saving without quite knowing for what, and over the next 3 evenings he built her 2 more shelves to match the ones she had made, with the same groove along the front edge, fitted to the opposite wall. He did not announce that he was doing it. He did not say anything when they were done. He simply left them there and went to start supper. June found them on a Wednesday morning and she stood in the doorway of the small room for a long time. She did not say anything to Lorne that day, but that Sunday evening, for the first time since she had arrived, she played the fiddle with the door of the small room open, so the sound came down the hallway and into the kitchen where he was reading, and he sat and let it come. "I am going to tell you about the morning in March, when everything became what it was going to be, because I think it matters to say it plainly. There was a storm the night before. Not a dangerous one, but the kind that dumps 60 centimeters in 8 hours, and buries everything horizontal, and makes the morning look like the world has been reset." Lorne was up before light, as always, and he came into the kitchen to start the stove and found June already there, standing at the window above the sink with a mug of coffee in both hands, looking out at the white. She did not hear him come in and he did not announce himself. He just stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. This woman he had written a box number for. This woman who had driven herself down a gravel road in a Subaru and told him his fence posts needed attention before she had said hello. This woman who fixed leaks before mentioning them and built shelves from salvaged wood, and sat in a barn on a hard night, and asked if a calf had a name. And he felt something that he had not felt in a long time and had not particularly expected to feel again. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was quiet the way the important things are often quiet. It was the feeling of recognizing something. Of looking at a person in your kitchen in the early morning in the snow, and understanding that they belong there. Not because you planned it, but because it has simply become true. He said, "You're up early," June said, without turning around. "I always wake up when the snow stops. The quiet is different." He said, "Yes." She turned then and she looked at him, and something in the way she looked was different from all the other times she had looked at him across this kitchen. More open or less defended or simply more honest, and he did not look away. She said, "In Ukraine where my grandmother was from there's a word, zatish. It means a sheltered place out of the wind. The kind of quiet that happens when she says something that holds." She looked back out the window. She said, "I keep thinking about that word this winter." Lorne was quiet for a moment. He said in Gaelic, "My grandfather was from the Outer Hebrides. There's Fasgath, same thing more or less, a shelter. A place the wind doesn't reach." June turned and looked at him again and this time neither of them said anything and neither of them needed to. The word had been said. Both versions of it from 2 different directions, arriving at the same place. The coffee was still hot. Outside the window the snow was blue in the early light, and the mountains were invisible behind cloud, and the cattle would need checking in an hour, and there were 100 practical things between this moment and the end of the day. Neither of them moved to start them yet. Lorne Mackay and June Alderton were married at the courthouse in Pincher Creek on a Friday in June. On a morning that was clear enough to see the mountains from the parking lot. The witnesses were the county clerk, and a rancher named Bev Theriot who had been Lorne's nearest neighbor for 15 years and who cried. Which surprised everyone including Bev Theriot. The reception was a supper at the ranch, 14 people, a table built from sawhorses and plywood, and covered with good cloth, and June played the fiddle on the porch after dinner, while the light went long and gold across the grass the way it does in June in the foothills when the year is being generous. The shelves in the small room grew. By the 3rd year they covered 2 walls and held books and records, and a fiddle case that was newer than the first one, and a photograph of Lorne's grandfather standing in front of a stone croft on an island that looked nothing like Alberta and exactly like the beginning of something. June's father came to visit in the summers and sat on the porch and said it was the best view he had ever had from a chair. Lorne taught him to identify the peaks by name, and her father taught Lorne 3 words of Ukrainian that Lorne kept forgetting and kept asking to hear again. June went back to part-time nursing at the Pincher Creek Hospital, 2 days a week, because she was good at it, and because she missed it, and because Lorne told her, when she brought it up carefully, as if she were asking permission, "You should do what you're good at. The ranch doesn't need you here every day. I do not need you here every day. That's not why you're here." She looked at him for a long moment. After that she said, "You know that was the right thing to say." He said, "I know. I have told you this story because I think it is important, and not for the reason you might expect. It would be easy to say that Lorne Mackay got lucky. That he put out an ad for practicality and got something better than he planned for. That would be true, but it would miss the point. The harder truth is that Lorne Mackay had been ready for June Alderton for years before she arrived. He had built the ranch. He had learned the land. He had put in the kind of patient, unglamorous work that makes something real. And then he had stayed in it long enough, alone, to understand what was actually missing. He was not a man who needed to be fixed. He was a man who had made himself into someone worth arriving for. And June Alderton, who had options, who had a career in a city and a life that worked, chose to drive down a gravel road in April because the letter she received in response to her 3 direct questions was written by a man who answered them honestly and did not flinch. And she knew that was rarer than the address suggested. They were not romantic in the conventional sense. They did not declare things. They built shelves and calved heifers and fixed fence posts, and rode in silence along ridges where the grass went on forever. And in the spaces between those ordinary things they found each other, quietly, without fanfare, the way the important things are always found. The best love stories are not the ones that arrive all at once with their intentions clear. They are the ones that show up in a Subaru on a muddy April morning, ask 3 direct questions, and refuse to be anything less than exactly what they are. So tell me, what was the moment in your mind when Lorne stopped treating this as an arrangement and started understanding what it actually was? Because I suspect you noticed it before he did.